When we talk about early splits in the church, and there are quite a few of them, we need to keep in mind that the church wasn't really all that united in the first place. When Christianity began, communication was difficult and no doctrine was set. Instead, people relied upon larger Christian communities in major cities to help resolve questions. So over time, these larger communities became bishoprics as areas of the world united by culture and trade would trade ideas and solve problems together. Over time, 4 major centers developed, each based, not surprisingly, on a different principal language. The group centered on the city of Rome in Italy spoke primarily Latin with a bit of Greek. The one centered on Constantinople in modern Turkey used primarily Greek. Antioch in modern-day Syria used Old Syriac, and the area around Alexandria in Egypt relied upon Coptic, an old Egyptian language that used Greek letters. During the time of rampant persecution in the early centuries of Christianity, while the church hadn't split over anything, it hadn't had any real chance to be united either. Conversation between groups was minimal, and the debates were basic enough that most of the decisions could be almost universally agreed upon. But when Christianity stopped being persecuted in 313 under Emperor Constantine, this changed. Councils were called with bishops from all around the church, and in the first several, the basic Nicene Creed, a statement on Jesus being fully God and fully human, and a statement on the nature of the Trinity was all agreed upon. The problem was that the doctrine of the Trinity, agreed upon, used language in such specific ways to explain it that it was difficult to translate into any other language. As time went on, Greek, the language that the Declaration was designed for, was used less and less around any church except those near Constantinople. And this became a problem when the discussion turned to Jesus. See, everyone agreed that Jesus was 100% God and 100% human and in an actual earthly body. How that worked was under discussion, but attempting to use the same language as they used previously to describe the Trinity caused a great deal of disagreement. In particular, this disagreement centered around 3 words: ousia, meaning essence, nature, or being; hypostasis, meaning essence, existence, or person; and prosopon, meaning person or face. Now, imagine the confusion when people are trying to discuss how in one prosopon, person, 2 hypostasis, persons, existed. Well, depending on how you translated it, that statement is meaningless, right? I mean, it's the same thing depending on how you translate it. So people were disagreeing quite strongly, sometimes over the wording and sometimes over the content. And these arguments lasted for a century or so. And while this discussion is important, let me put up the 3 main views of the era and see if you can pick out which one is the officially correct view today. A, that Jesus was 2 natures, divine and human, which existed as one in the person of Jesus. B, that Jesus was 2 natures, divine and human, united but not joined in the one person of Jesus. Or that Jesus was one unique nature of God and humanity entwined, and whose unique essence was expressed in the divine existence of the person Jesus. Now, if this seems confusing, it's because, well, it is. By the way, option B is actually the official Orthodox position. But in any given church today, it would be reasonable to expect to find a few people holding any of those views. And over the course of 2 supposedly ecumenical councils, the church split twice. And not surprisingly, it was all the people who didn't speak Greek well who left, because the definitions didn't make any sense in translation. The first to break away was the church to the east of the Roman Empire, aptly named Church of the East, who in 424 declared themselves separate from the rest of the church and then officially broke all ties with the church in 431. Because they believed that the natures of Jesus, divine and human, stayed as united but intact and distinct aspects of the person Jesus. The Church of the East expanded to India, establishing bishops in China and Mongolia, staying vibrant even under Islamic rule until the 1300s or so. After a split in the 1500s, it split again in 1968, and today is represented by the Chaldean Catholic Church, the Assyrian Church of the East, and the Ancient Church of the East. These denominations today primarily differ from Orthodox or Roman Catholics in rituals and traditions, not in doctrine. And many practices we think of as Islamic were actually taken from practices of the Church of the East, like 5 daily prayers and praying facing their holy city, in the case of Christians, Jerusalem, or fasting while it is daylight during their holy month, in the Church's case, Lent, in Islam's case, Ramadan. The second branch of Christianity, which separated itself, are today called the Oriental Orthodox Churches, which is a group of autonomous denominations, which include the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria, the Syrian Orthodox Church of Antioch, the Armenian Apostolic Church, and others. Basically, all the Christians who lived outside of Persia, like the Church of the East lived inside, but also lived outside of the sway of Greek and Latin. These churches also disagreed with what the councils decided on the nature of Jesus, though their stance has shifted since they initially left. And these are amazing places, because the Armenian Church is legitimately one of the oldest surviving continuous places of worship of Christianity in the world. And the Coptic Church has a great deal to teach us today, as there has been no other Christian group who has been under such intense persecution for so long, living in Egypt under Islamic rule for 1400 years. And yet, even today, about 10% of Egypt's population are Coptic Christians. But don't think either of these splits were truly sudden. Think of the dates given as when they recognized that they had little in common anymore. But the actual breaks in the relationship had been going on for centuries as they slowly drifted apart in practice and theology. Which is exactly how the last major split in this time period came about. Even after the Roman Empire split in half, the Church remained fairly united. But as time went by, the Western Roman Empire collapsed completely, requiring the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, to assume the role of providing order to Western Europe. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire was still doing okay, and that church was ruled by a council of ranking bishops, who refused to acknowledge the Bishop of Rome as their leader. And tensions were stressed at best for hundreds of years. But the final blow came when in 1014 the Church in the West took the creed that everyone had agreed on and added the words "and the Son." Specifically, they changed it to say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. The Pope saw himself as the head of the Church, and so this was well within his rights to clarify things, while the East saw it as an attack on the Trinity and making the Holy Spirit under the Son. And that was enough. They formally split in 1054. And it is interesting to note, however coincidental it might be, that the Crusades began only 50 years later, pushing the West deep into the Eastern Church's traditional realm. Now, the eastern half of the Church called themselves the Orthodox, meaning right-believing Church, and the West termed themselves the Catholic, or Universal Church. And while next week we'll look at the splits within the West, the Orthodox Church slowly also split into separate entities, all theoretically together, but in practice quite separate. Today, those include the Russian Orthodox Church, as well as the Bulgarian, Romanian, Serbian, Ukrainian, Georgian Orthodox churches, the Church of Greece, Church of Cyprus, several others. All of these are similar in their beliefs, but differ in the rituals and liturgy that they practice, particularly the language that they use in their liturgy. And the Orthodox Church has a great deal that they can teach us as well today, particularly their views of monasticism and seeking the presence of God in everything that you do, something that the Jesuits picked up on centuries later. But that, in a nutshell, is the first 1,000 years of Christian denominations and splits. I left out all of the heresies and syncretistic practices that flourished for a brief moment before dying out, because they showed themselves not to be truth, and just instead stuck with the major ideas and differences within Christianity. Next week, I will take a look at some of the reforms that happened within the church, some of the ways that they prevented splits, and maybe how we can prevent splits too. And then probably start beginning to ramp up to the Protestant Reformation and the birth of what most Americans today know as church. I hope you'll come and join me for it. But as always, thank you for watching. Have a great week. See you next Friday.